Good morning once again. Welcome to our first ever climate governance webinar series. And CARICAD is very pleased to be partnering with a number of our stakeholders to put on and deliver this webinar series. And just to name those partners, two of whom are presenting today. So we have a number of member of understanding with partners because we believe that together we can do much more than if we go it alone. And so for today, our partnership is specifically with the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, and the 5 C's, as we popularly call it. No, I always get that name a little bit incorrect. So allow me to just make sure I am reading the right name. Hello, right? The Caribbean Community Climate Change Center that is located in Belize. Other partners that we're going to have sharing with us. So next week, we are going to have Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. The third webinar, we'll have CRIF SPC, and they're going to be looking at disaster risk financing. And CARICAD will be rounding out in terms of leading on the presentation for the final and fourth webinar. This webinar series is important, and it's part of an ongoing strategy of hopefully continuing to increase our capacity to address issues of climate change. If you don't know already, and I suspect we all do, that our region, the Caribbean region, is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to the impacts of climate change. We're talking about things like increasing, rising sea levels, stronger hurricanes, more frequent ones, longer dry seasons, just to name a few. And that's in addition to all the other normal natural disasters. And so this has major implications for us in the region, for our populations, for our personal safety, and certainly for our socioeconomic development. And so we at CARICAD, through and with our partners, are very much concerned with how do we ensure that we build the capacity to enable not only our public services, but our wider societies to have the know-how, the skills, the tools, the techniques, the understanding and knowledge to implement appropriate climate governance policies. And so today, to lay the groundwork, we are going to be looking at climate change, an essential imperative. And our first presenter is going to be, I consider my good friend, Mr. Keith Nichols. He hails from the Helen of the Caribbean, St. Lucia, and he is from 5 C's. He is very much very highly trained. He has a master's in marine management from the University of Rhode Island, and he has just a wealth of experience in this field, and he's going to be sharing from that storehouse of knowledge with us. After his presentation, we're going to have from CDEMA, Dr. Nicole Greenwich. And Nicole is a disaster risk management specialist with CDEMA, has a PhD in human geography from the University of Manchester in the UK. Again, both of them together, just literally years and years of practical experience and know-how on this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to allow Keith to share his and to start his presentation. And so while his presentation and both presentations are going on, we're going to invite you to use the chat. We're going to have a segment for discussion at the end, of course, but we invite you, even while the presentation are going on, you can put your questions in the chat, your comments, and we'll be monitoring that. We're not overly formal in our webinars, as you may know, and so we really want this to be as interactive as possible. Let's talk about the things that really are top of mind to us. All right. So Keith, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. Good morning. There's no way in the world I think I can match your passion and your emotions this morning, your commitment to this. So I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to try.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh
And,
dear. I set the bar high, haven't I?
oh, yes, certainly. And to answer your last question, what compels us to be here this morning? Well, I'm presenting, so I have no choice. But in any event, it's an area close to our heart. It's our work. It's what we do. It's maybe the most important element in our fight to address the climate crisis. And everyone's referring to a climate crisis these days. Climate governance is maybe the key element that would help us resolve the issues that we're facing today with climate change. Now, please let me know if you're seeing my presentation. I know with my multiple screens and my inability to navigate those, let me know that you are seeing the full presentation and that we are my slides are advancing.
Yes to both.
Oh, beautiful. Good. Thanks. So I'm going to be speaking on climate governance this morning, and some of you will know a lot of the terms. You're familiar with the issues. I am not going to claim that I know more than you guys, but it is my work, and I'm just here to share with you some of the key constructs in our climate governance scenario, both globally, regionally, and nationally. So in the presentation this morning, I will look at context, setting the context for this presentation. And one thing I learned a long time ago was that we can't assume that all of us are on the same page as it relates to understanding what climate change is. So I'm just going to run us through a very short presentation on the context, some definitions to explain what it is we're talking about and go into climate governance. So for the context setting, I look at weather, climate change, and governance. And then we shift into the substance, the main substance of this presentation on climate governance. And we look at the international arena, we look at the regional environment for governance and national obligations as well. So context setting, what is weather? Now, you're familiar with weather. You have weather reports on a daily basis. We provide weather information every single day, I think, to all the countries in the region, and we know what that is. So you what's the weather like in your part of the world today, if you're in the UK or North America or wherever? And weather is the conditions that we experience on a daily basis. It's, wind, temperature, cloudiness, moisture, sun, and that sort of thing, precipitation, and that sort of thing. So that is weather. And so you wouldn't ask someone, what was the weather like in your country last year? Yeah, you could maybe very, very general terms of, well, it was basically fairly cloudy. We had major droughts or that sort of thing. You can't ask those questions. But weather is like what it is today. Now, and it's the state of everything that we spoke of. These are the parameters. So that brings us to climate. And what is climate? Because climate is essentially an amalgamation of the weather, a composite of all the prevailing weather conditions of a region. Now, you wouldn't ask me or the weather forecaster what's the climate in St. Lucia today or in Barbados today. No, we'll say what's the weather in Barbados today? What's the weather in Anguilla today? What's the weather in Guyana today? We wouldn't ask, what's the climate in Guyana today? The climate is a general composite, and this is what has established itself over a very long period of time, average over a series of years. So we take weather, we accumulate those over a 30-year period to give us a really good picture of what the climate is. And we can ask, what's the climate in North America? Well, we got seasons, 4 seasons, we got winter, we got summer, we got fall, etc., etc. Or what's the climate in the Caribbean? And your climate is a tropical climate, and you heard the term. So it's an amalgamation of what defines the characteristics of any region, and that is climate. So weather is what we have. It's those parameters. Climate is the accumulation of the composite of all of those parameters over a very long period of time, over a series of years. And to give us a sense of what that picture is, normally require an average of about 30 years to get a sense of what your climate is over the time. And it's everything related to pressure, humidity, precipitation, sunshine, cloudiness, etc. So what is climate change? And, it's maybe the hottest topic in the world today. apart from maybe the coronation and everything happened in the US with former presidents and so on. What is climate change? Climate change, one, is a long-term continuous change. And the definition here we have on the screen is any change in climate over time, whether due to natural variability or as a result of human activity. Now, those two terms are highlighted: natural variability and human activity. Natural, because climate change is natural. Climate change is brought about by the Earth's orbit around the sun, the Earth's rotation in its axis, and that wobble, because that the axis wobbles from a few degrees over thousands of years. So all these things create what is called natural climate change. Climate change always existed. So anyone says that climate change is fake, it's not real, has no clue about what they're talking. Absolutely no clue, because climate change is what this Earth thrives on. This is why life exists on this Earth, because of natural climate change. So the climate is changing, yes, it's always changing naturally. But because of human activity, then just industrialization in the 1700s, what we've seen is an acceleration of that climate change, leading to global warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification, because of the emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other gases that now serve to trap heat in the atmosphere, causing global warming and all the other consequences as a result. So this is what climate change is. But like I said, climate change is natural. What we are seeing is the exacerbation of the impact of natural climate change by our emissions. So what is governance? Which is why we're here today and talking. What is governance? So why governance? There are numerous definitions all over. If you research governance on Google or anywhere else, for example, they all speak to more or less the same thing in different ways. The dynamic interaction between people, structures, processes, and traditions that support the exercise of legitimate authority, etc., etc. It speaks to accountability and transparency, responsiveness, consensus-oriented. Not that we're doing very well in those areas. We're not necessarily doing well. It speaks to participatory engagement of all stakeholders, inclusivity, following the rule of law, efficiency, accountability. These are all issues of governance, good governance, that should prescribe how we conduct our business of governance. And that's why we put the structures in place to ensure that we can benefit politically, economically, and of course, to ensure benefits to civil society. So governance is simply putting in place the systems that allow for the various interactions to provide benefits on all the fronts, the political, economic, and the social front as well. It's that interaction. It's all about people. We don't manage the climate. We don't manage anything else. We manage people and people's engagements. And that's important to remember. It's all about people. So let's just proceed on the issue of governance. And governance occurs at 3 levels. Climate governance, that is. Here we're talking global. And that relates to the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that drives the global governance protocols for climate change. The Kyoto Protocol, which is an extension, and we'll talk more about that in a bit, the Conference of Parties, the annual meetings of Conference of Parties, and of course, a key instrument here, the Paris Agreement. Then we talk about regional governance. What have we done and what have we put in place at the regional level? And here we're talking about the revised regional framework for achieving development resilient to climate change. We're talking disaster risk management as well. And national, we've got obligations through our NDCs as nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, our obligations to multilateral environmental agreements, disaster risk management. These are all elements of governance at the 3 levels. So at the global level, what is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? This was adopted out of the Global Conference in 1992, the Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. And primarily, the objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere that will prevent the dangerous effects and impacts we're seeing today. And of course, an extension to the UNFCCC is the Kyoto Protocol, which primarily commits or should attempt to commit state parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Based on the understanding that climate change is real, enhanced climate change is real, global warming is occurring at an accelerated pace, and that our emissions of greenhouse gases is what's driving the changes we're seeing today. Some very, very serious issues that we have got to deal with in attempting to stem the emissions. It's the biggest challenge facing all the countries today. How do we control emissions, particularly when they're countries that are, as far as you're concerned, it has to be business as usual. We don't want to compromise the integrity of our commerce. And I'm sure you've heard that before. So United Nations climate change negotiations is what helps drive consensus building on the reduction of greenhouse gases, and speaks also to climate finance and adaptation and other mitigation type factors as well. So we've seen some transformation over the years from 2011 to now, where the Conference of Parties is still an ongoing. We're preparing for COP28 and the United Arab Emirates, this year. The Kyoto Protocol is still relevant, very, very relevant. Well, Paris Agreement remains the main instrument for addressing the obligations to which countries signed on. And of course, we have a number of other instruments, the bodies that meet throughout the entire year to negotiate the aspects of the Paris Agreement to which we have signed on, and to ensure that states commit and act on their obligations. Right now, we're not doing a very, very good job in that regard. So we've got the Paris Agreement. I'm sure you've heard about Paris Agreement. This is when the Caribbean was very instrumental in promoting the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign through youth organizations and civil society. And this was maybe the most successful element of the work of our negotiations at the Conference of Parties. And I think we made a splash. It was a really huge event and a huge benefit to us in the region. So the agreement includes commitments from all countries to reduce emissions. This is signature because, and no pun intended, because we had 192 countries sign on. Today, there are 194 parties to the Paris Agreement, and this is unprecedented. And it calls on countries to strengthen their commitments over the time, and that's the commitments to reducing emissions. Another part of it speaks to climate finance. We get to climate finance in a bit. But in order for us to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, we need monies. We need money. And that's the big issue about us building our resilience to the impacts of climate change. So the key parameters in all of this is what? Mitigation, which relates to emissions reduction. So when you hear mitigation in the perspective of the UNFCCC, climate change, we're talking about reducing emissions. That's what mitigation is. Adaptation means building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And we're not doing a very good job on that because it requires monies to adapt. Then climate finance. It's a key element in today's negotiations because our countries simply cannot afford the cost of adaptation. And that goalpost is moving quicker than we can meet our financial obligations. So the impacts of the storms and everything else is happening at a far greater rate, and the consequences that we're able to address those through climate financing. And of course, we need to be able to report on our NDCs and through what is called the global stocktake. And we'll come to that in a short while. So the Paris Agreement provides for each party to set its own emissions targets. And you got to report on what is called the nationally determined contributions. Every country is supposed to report on their contributions to reducing emissions. But the thing about the NDC is it's not legally binding. Like most things of a global nature, they are not legally binding or obligatory. So if a country reneges on this agreement or does not submit its report to NDCs, what can anyone do about it? Nothing. Nothing at all. And at least the question, what is the value of those NDCs? Normally, the countries that are most affected, that contribute very little to emissions, are the ones reporting more generously on the NDCs, more loyally on the NDCs. So there is a global stock take. And in fact, this year we're working to what is a global stock take. And that primarily is to look at the performance of the Paris Agreement. It's supposed to be done every 5 years. The reporting is taking place this year, 2023, and to assess the collective progress towards the agreement's objectives. So in 2023 at COP in UAE, the report will provide information on how have we fared in that time? How well have we done over that period of time? And this will be a collective review of all the NDCs and to see what countries have done. And I must admit that the ambition of countries that are least contributing the least to emissions are the ones who ensure that they commit to reporting on the NDCs. But this is always the case. The bigger countries, can't do anything about bigger countries and reporting, but we will see what the report brings out this year. So that global stock take is happening. It's going to be reported on this year at COP28. So at the regional level, what are we doing at the regional level? I should indicate that the CARICOM region may be the first in the world to put in place a framework for addressing the impacts of climate change on development. And this took the form of what is called the Lilienthal Declaration, was a vision issued by CARICOM heads in 2009. At the same time, CARICOM heads had endorsed the regional strategy for achieving development resilient to climate change. And that put in place, that established the aspirations of member states, the priorities for addressing climate change in 2009. And of course, there was a corresponding implementation plan, which is endorsed by CARICOM heads in 2012. It's called Delivering Transformational Change, as you can see on the screen. And that was the implementation plan to the strategy, which was endorsed by heads in 2009. And since that time, and this is the platform, this was very forward thinking at the time. As no other country in the world has done anything like this. I represented at least the foresight, the ambition of CARICOM heads to recognize that climate change is an issue, it's a problem in the region, but we need to have a system in place to help manage the impacts of climate change. And of course, to address the issue of climate finance. So since, of course, 2009, we've had a series of changes. We've had the Paris Agreement, we've had a change from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, and a number of other changes at the global and regional scene as well. And those need to be reflected in the revised regional framework that guides all our work or the aspirations of member states in addressing the impacts of climate change within the region. So through broad-based collaboration with all the countries, what emerged was 11 strategic elements, 11 pillars of development, and which reflects the aspirations of member states to address and fully integrate climate change into our decision-making, our planning, and governance as well. This reflects governance once we get this operational. And strategic element number 9 relates to responsive reporting and governance frameworks. So everything is reflected in the strategic elements or the regional framework, which is revised, and the corresponding implementation plan is now being revised as we speak to reflect those new aspirations and the actions we need to pursue to give effect to those goals, the aspirational, the pillars and the goals associated with those strategic elements. So what is the institutional makeup for governance within the Caribbean? So of course, there's CARICOM heads. And CARICOM heads have now ensured that climate change is a permanent fixture on the agenda of all heads meetings. So we now have to report on climate change progress within this region at every meeting of heads. This is unprecedented, but this is really, really good because it gives opportunity for heads to understand the implications of the global environment, decisions made at that level, and how it impacts our work at the national level, at the regional and national level. So this is a very, very positive development for heads now that we're incorporating climate change in their discussions at every meeting of heads. The CARICOM operates through what is called the CARICOM quasi-cabinet. And so each CARICOM head has a lead responsibility for an area, whether it's ports, whether it's agriculture, etc. And the CARICOM lead head for sustainable development, which includes climate change, is the Prime Minister of St. Lucia or his delegate. So we are working with the Prime Minister of St. Lucia and his minister who has responsibility for climate change to help advance the region's agenda as well through Quartet and others. And of course, there's no need for me to remind you the sterling work being done by Mia Motley from Barbados, now a global fixture in the conversation on climate change and a voice of our large oceans as small island developing states. I have to emphasize the large ocean because that normally is lost in the equation. Of course, so the 5Cs reports the Quartet, the Council of Trade and Economic Development, but under the ministers with responsibility for climate change. And of course, member states report, we work with our member states. So that is the institutional framework for governance on climate change within the region. A 5Cs has a regional mandate to guide the region's response to climate change, but we can't do it alone. Nor it is intended we do everything. We are a self-financing entity, which means we're unique in that regard. We don't receive subventions from member states compared to some of the other CARICOM entities. But we work with every single institution, whether regional organizations, international institutions, member states, of course, our beneficiaries, the beneficiaries of our investments in climate change. We work with all our regional partners under the banner, of course, CARICOM Secretariat, to advance the work of climate change, all within the respective mandates of the existing entities. And there's something called the 3 1s principle. We speak to one regional plan, one regional coordinating mechanism, and one regional monitoring and evaluation system. And that is embedded in the revised regional framework and the original regional framework as well. So here in the one regional plan, we speak to the Liliendahl Declaration, the regional framework, and of course implementation plan as one document at that first tier level. The coordinating mechanism, CARICOM we had established what is called the Regional Coordinating Committee on Climate Change, which is an amalgamation of all the various entities within the region, all the CARICOM entities, organizations, the CDB, the development banks within the region, the civil society organizations, the private sector are on that to help coordinate the investments in climate change resilience building within the region. And that mechanism is also led by the CARICOM lead head for sustainable development, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, or his delegate. And we have met a few times. It needs to be revisited prior to well, during COVID, nothing happened. That's a mechanism that needs to be reinstituted. And of course, a monitoring and evaluation system, because we need to be able to measure our progress over time. The same applies. So at the regional level, we have this, but at national level, we still need to have this one national plan. We need to have a national coordinating mechanism. And some countries have a system in place that embraces all the various partners in government, private sector, civil society, and the public sector, of course, certainly, and of course, the national monitoring and evaluation system, that some of those instruments still need to be strengthened and built firmly. But at the national level, we are aspiring to social equity, environmental stability, economic stability, and growth, the financial equity, and of course, our institutional integrity as well. These are the key areas that we need to address at the national level to ensure that we're fully addressing the issues related to climate change, but that is inclusive. It embraces the inputs of all our stakeholders, since every single individual will be impacted by climate change, directly or indirectly, and there's no getting away from this. So we will need to have some policy, legal, and institutional reform. Some countries already have a national climate change policy. Some are revising that policy as we speak. We need to amend legislation to ensure that it is in keeping with the new directive, the new emerging factors relating to climate change. We need to revise possibly our institutional frameworks to ensure that we're given full effect to governance. A lead ministry, because climate change is money, adaptation costs, mitigation costs. There's a role for the Ministry of Finance. There's a role for the Ministry of Economic Development. In many instances, climate change is relegated to a position in the Department of Environment. The question is that the best place to have it, given the fact that we're talking about investments in resilience building that requires monies that our economies don't have? So there has to be some careful thought given to where do you place that responsibility, since it is a national overarching responsibility. And of course, we have obligations to reporting at the global level as well. Water remains the key element in our economic growth, and it impacts all the sectors. And you can see from this, because all the sectors are linked, it places emphasis on the need to have a multi-sectoral committee engaged in public sector, the private sector, civil society, and a governance framework that addresses all the issues relating to all those areas. Any impact in any one sector will impact the others as well. So we need a governance system that recognizes those linkages, takes that into consideration, and we change away from the silo approach that currently describes what it is, how we do business. So why climate governance? It will impact, it's already impacting all our sectors. No one is going to be spared. We must take immediate and aggressive action. Global finance is key to assisting our low SIDS, large ocean SIDS, with adaptation and mitigation costs, because those costs are beyond the capabilities of member states to address. When you think of the impacts of the hurricanes of 2017, Maria and Irma, Hurricane Dorian in 2019, and all those that came before, the tropical storms Erica in Dominica in 2015, and so on, and go back in time, every country is impacted. And we always look for monies beyond our economies to help recovery. So access to finance must be easier. Yes, we've got the Green Climate Fund, but accessing the finance is not as easy as it should be, as it could be, as it should be. So access to finance has to be easier. You will see this in Nicole's presentation, so I'm not going to go into this, but we know for a fact that extreme weather events will spawn catastrophic consequences. Disaster risk reduction is an absolute imperative. Building climate risk, a climate risk ethos is our only solution. We've got to think climate risk in every single thing that we do. If we have to stem the impacts, or at least manage those impacts that are under our control and ability to do so. So the time to act is now. This is the end of my presentation, but it's never too late. And let me take this opportunity to thank CARICAD and of course CDEMA for inviting 5Cs to partake in this presentation. But I think it's very, very timely. We're talking about climate governance. It's a really important topic. There's a lot more that we still need to do. I think we've made some serious inroads into how we do business within the region. There's a lot more we need to do, but that time to act is now. And all of us have an obligation. Every single entity, those of us on this call, have an obligation to helping advance that platform to a point where we can really see some gains in our resilience building efforts. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. And just to answer a quick question, yes, the recordings and the slide decks will be shared with registrants after the webinar. And I see facing excellent presentation, Keith. So we are going to transition now to Nicole's presentation. And so Nicole, you can start, sharing your screen, but perhaps we're going to have a discussion segment after Nicole's presentation, but it could be that you have a comment or a question just based on Keith's presentation right now. And so I'm wondering if anybody, would want to pose a question at this time. You could either just raise your hand or type in the chat. And so Keith, just one thing you did say, you talked about emerging challenges that, new and emerging challenges that are arising as a result of, climate change impacts. And no, if Nicole is going to cover that, they can just let me know. But I was curious to know, what are some of those new and emerging things, and new and emerging challenges that we have on top of all the other struggles we have already?
Yeah, interesting question. I think, we don't know a whole lot about how climate change will impact every single facet of our existence. We don't know a whole lot. We're not going to talk about COVID because COVID was not necessarily climate change. But let me talk about health. Here we have an issue with the migration of disease vectors northward, because the conditions have become more favorable in places that were not traditionally the habitat of some disease vectors. Malaria, for example, And the malaria mosquito is migrating northwards. There are concerns in North America because conditions are becoming more favorable, more tropical. It's becoming warmer. So this is just one particular issue. And we think of, I mean, we knew before then, before COVID, things like dengue, chikungunya, and so on. And there are fears that, for example, that as we've seen the melt in the Arctic and Antarctic, that there may be a release of other pathogens into the air, into the atmosphere that may be even more disastrous than COVID was. So there may be hidden elements because the earth is changing so much. We're seeing the droughts, the seasonal droughts. Droughts have become, we have a dry season, yes, but droughts are becoming an annual feature of our landscape, of our weatherscape. And we're talking serious droughts. We're talking forest fires as a consequence. Think of every fire and what that fire does to biodiversity in the forest. Although fire is a natural phenomenon in the forest, we think of the loss of biodiversity as a consequence. There are changes happening. So we're still beginning to see, for example, oceans. We're seeing pathogens in coral reefs that we didn't see before. Coral reefs are dying. A major habitat for ocean biodiversity is the coral reef. The barrier reef, Great Barrier Reef of Australia has suffered tremendously over the years. So, some of those are kind of hidden because it's not like mainstream media. The mainstream media doesn't report on those things. They talk about people and things happening with people. But those factors, you got to search for it. Maybe in the PBS or other more responsive radio media house. But these things are real and impacting us, but we don't get the full stories concerning the changes that are taking place, particularly when it's convenient for some to deny that climate change exists and has implications for how we do business. So there's a whole lot, I guess, we don't know. How our crops will respond to changing conditions.
Yeah.
We're seeing trees bear fruit now at different seasons. Everything is changing. So we don't fully understand it, which is why I think we need to be prepared. We need to do the research. We need to understand what is happening. And we need to put in place the systems to address, maybe through flood-resistant crops or drought-resistant crops. There's a lot of work we need to do.
Understood.
And that's just not in a nutshell.
Yeah. So, what we need to know, what's emerging, it's something is always unfolding, and the need for, as Maria is a very useful comment in the chat, the need for a One Health approach to ensure that we have a multidisciplinary view of, the interaction between human, animals, planetary health, and illuminating those links, those interlinkages. Thank you so much. So let me invite now Dr. Nicole Greenwich from CEDEMA. She was already introduced. So, Madam Nicole, we hand over the reins to you now. And for those who are just joining, welcome. We're going to move to the second of our two presentations this morning, looking at climate governance, an essential imperative. Dr. Nicole.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning to all who have logged on for today's webinar. What an excellent presentation that Keith gave, setting for us the context and laying an excellent foundation. As you've heard, I am Dr. Nicole Greenwich. I'm the Disaster Risk Management Specialist at CEDEMA. And I'm extremely—
Nicole, just to say, your slides is not in presentation mode as yet.
Ew. Let me see. Is that okay?
No, we're still seeing like the presenter view and not the full presentation view. Just give us a moment, folks.
Yes. Let me switch to something different.
There you are.
Oh, okay. All right. So I have to switch my, okay. So as I was saying, I am the Disaster Risk Management Specialist at CEDEMA, and I'm absolutely pleased to be here this morning to give this presentation on the topic of climate governance, an essential imperative. I want to acknowledge my colleague who's on the line, Ms. Gail Drakes, the education specialist at CEDEMA. Gail has worked behind the scenes on the concept for the seminar and delivery, and so I want to acknowledge her. So I want to pick up from where Keith stopped. And to do that, the structure that I'll take for the presentation will be to just give you an introduction to SEDIMA and comprehensive disaster management, to say more about the imperative for an integrated approach, to look at some guiding frameworks from a disaster risk management perspective, some emerging approaches for how we're going forward with an integrated approach and what can be leveraged, and then to stimulate discussion with some questions for reflection, and to also give you some ideas as it relates to possible pathways for going forward. I want you to take these 6 messages home today. One, that effective climate governance, that approach must integrate disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. 2, that an integrated climate governance approach can be applied in practice. 3, that there are emerging approaches for consideration. 4, there's a need to translate that guidance into practice. 5, there are a few pathways for consideration to facilitate that integrated and resilient approach to governance. And there's a role for each one of us. And finally, it is therefore then important for us to understand what that role is, to rethink our approaches, to identify the synergies and interconnectedness across our policies, strategies, plans, and programs. So who is SEDIMA? SEDIMA is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. It is a regional intergovernmental agency established by the heads of government of the Caribbean community with responsibility for disaster management. The agreement establishing SEDIMA specifies 6 objectives of the agency. The first speaks to mobilizing and coordinating disaster relief. This would be more visible, supporting our states in this regard. B, mitigating or eliminating as far as practicable the immediate consequences of disasters in our participating states. C, providing immediate and coordinated response by means of emergency disaster relief to any affected state. D, securing, coordinating, and providing to interested intergovernmental and NGOs reliable and comprehensive information on disasters that are affecting any of our states. E, encouraging the adoption of disaster loss reduction and mitigation policies and practices at the national and regional level, and also encouraging cooperative arrangements and mechanisms to facilitate the development of a culture of disaster loss reduction. And finally, coordinating the establishment, enhancement, and maintenance of adequate emergency disaster response capabilities among our states. And this includes ensuring that we have a regional response mechanism that is effective and the associated plans and warehouses across the region so that we can mount a response when necessary. Today's focus on climate governance relates then to our role in encouraging disaster loss reduction and mitigation policies and practices. This relates to disaster mitigation, which is different from climate change mitigation. When I speak to mitigation here, I'm talking about reducing and preventing as far as possible potential risks from disasters, which is similar in some degree to climate change adaptation. So the SEDIMA participating states, they are shown on the screen, and we serve these 19 countries. So as far north as the Bahamas, going across to Belize, coming all along the island chain, the archipelago, and then we have Guyana and Suriname. These 19 countries make up SEDIMA, and any Caribbean state that wants to join SEDIMA can do so. It is not limited only to the members of CARICAD. Comprehensive disaster management. This is the brand of disaster management in the Caribbean. And SEDIMA is the broker for this brand of disaster management. When we talk about comprehensive disaster management, our focus is not just on hurricanes or droughts or those hydrometeorological hazards. but it's talking about all hazards, including the geophysical ones, such as the eruption that you would have heard about in 2021 with last fair in St. Vincent, even oil spills going over to man-made hazards, and even we would have a role to play as it relates in the governance of climate-related hazards, those exacerbated or caused by climate change. I will elaborate more on that, but this is what we are brokering. Notice the word brokering in the Caribbean. This kind of approach that looks at all hazards across all sectors and also involving all people, private sector and the public sector, all segments of civil society has a role, and the general population in those hazard-prone areas. When we speak of comprehensive disaster management, we are not only speaking about coming in at the response or preparing, making a plan as to how we're going to put up shutters and or bring aid to a country, but we're looking at each of the phases of disaster management. And those are shown on the screen. Mitigation, preventing, reducing potential risks, preparing, response, and how do we recover? Comprehensive disaster management therefore involves risk reduction and management and integration of vulnerability assessment into the development planning process. And vulnerability really speaks to what are those characteristics that make you susceptible to be affected by a threat? Is it that you're just below the poverty line? Is it that you are in a female-headed household? What are those vulnerabilities that make you, what are those characteristics that make you susceptible? You can look at that broadly from a national perspective, as being small island developing states, and then even drilling down to the different levels at the local and the community level, and even individual level. So when we speak to comprehensive disaster management, when we speak to disaster risk reduction, we are looking more at turning the tap off, looking at the drivers of the risk, as opposed to just coming to clean up, mopping the floor. And so with the adoption of the comprehensive disaster management approach in 2001, this is now almost 22 years that we have been pushing this concept of disaster management in the Caribbean. We've seen an evolution from one principally concerned with response to one that's based on disaster risk reduction, giving greater attention to mitigating, preparing, and recovering. The question, though, is how far has this drilled down at the national level in terms of how people think? And then also, even when you think about in your department, when you think of the disaster management, or do you have this comprehensive view of disaster management, all hazards, all phases, risk reduction? The slide here shows examples of the kinds of disasters that we have been responding to in our region. And there's no doubt that we are seeing an increase in the scope, intensity, and frequency of disaster events in the Caribbean region. In 2021, and starting in 2020, we had COVID pandemic. Then we had a volcanic emergency in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, earthquake eruption in Haiti, flooding in Guyana. And prior to that, this slide shows other events going back to 2017 with Maria, Irma. I mean, we were just being battered one after the next. We also had oil spill to respond to in 2013 with Trinidad and Tobago. And there's also the ongoing matter of civil unrest in Haiti. These are all part of the multi-hazard context that we have to deal with in our region. And climate change will magnify these risks, particularly those associated with coastal erosion, those associated with inundation, flooding, tropical cyclones. 2017, we had back-to-back category 5. We are seeing storms that are more intense. Climate change is increasing and magnifying risks associated with fresh water. We're seeing additional issues with agricultural land salinization, and so forth. And it is anticipated that increases in temperature associated with climate change will affect our crop use. Keith spoke to that in his presentation, water availability. I mean, in Barbados right now, we are on a prohibition notice as it relates to water. We're restricted from using water for certain activities that are non-essential. It will impact life-sustaining ecosystems such as the coral reefs, which are already living near the limit of thermal tolerance in many of small and developing states. So I've been talking about climate change. I talked about the context, the complexity of hazards that we're facing. When we speak about disaster risk reduction, it is defined by the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Agency as what the aim there being is to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks, to manage any residual risk, and all of which the ultimate aim is to contribute to strengthening resilience and therefore the achievement of sustainable development. If we are constantly having to rebuild schools, rebuild roads, you know, our GDP is significantly eroded. We are indebted more as a result of being unable to absorb shocks from disaster risk. It's affecting us. It's affecting where we can be on the achievement of our sustainable development goals. This figure, it may seem a little bit complicated, but this is because the matter of understanding what risk is and the interactions is complicated, and trying to put it down in a diagram is really doesn't do justice to it. But I just want to hone in onto the middle part of the diagram, which just shows you how risk is constructed. And it is as a function of the vulnerability, those characteristics that make you susceptible, and name some of those. Maybe you're unemployed, your disabilities, indebtedness of a country, these kinds of things, they make you susceptible to the threat. And then you have the threats, which is the hazards, right? They have their own intensity, you know, they have their scales. And then there's exposure. You know, you're not going to get risky, you're not going to get a disaster if you're not in the place to be affected by it. And so these three, vulnerability, hazards, exposure, combine, and this is how we get risk. This is where we get the potential for losses and damages. And this is driven by non-climatic drivers. It's driven by the climatic drivers. Keith explained in his presentation very well about climate variability. And then you have the man-made implications, the anthropogenic climate change due to emissions and so forth. And all of these with changes in land use and so on, you know, how we build our roads, we now have more impermeable surfaces. We don't have good drainage anymore. We're putting houses in places that used to be gullies or areas for that would run straight to the sea, and so they're flooding out, and we don't have mitigative, we haven't taken mitigative actions and so forth, or considered the hazard in our planning. All of these combine to create risk, potential for loss, potential for damages. And in the discussion globally on disaster risk reduction is the call for us to understand that we are not an island. Yes, geographically we are, but the world is so interconnected. We see the impact of the war in the Ukraine on food security. We see the impact of that, of what's going on with China and America on shipping and things of that sort. We are globalized. And so risk also becomes more complex. We have systems that are interconnected, where you have income inequality, and that has an effect then on the market volatility, crop failure, spikes, conflicts, food insecurity. They interconnect and act on each other. And so we have to be able to discuss those interactions. They don't happen in silos. And trying to put it in a diagram or in a map it really doesn't capture it. This is where deliberations and conversations need to happen, but we need to understand that this is the new context in which we are to operate, and we have to plan for it and not just react. We have to take note of and take stock of the current complexity in our environment. On the screen, what I'm showing here is the interconnection between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. As I would have explained, risk reduction, disaster risk reduction is not about coming only to clean up and mop up after the disaster. In fact, the focus of risk reduction is really about ensuring that we reduce those vulnerabilities. And it's the same thing for climate change adaptation. And both of them seek to enhance resilience. So then why then do we have separate streams and actions? We need to link it up more. I think regionally we've understood that, and we need to be able to filter that down more at the national level. Yes, there are differences, and these are shown in this part of the diagram, where climate change is dealing with the climate-related hazards. Only risk reduction looks at encompasses all hazards. Climate change is taking a more long-term view, and whereas risk reduction focusing more on the extremes, and the list goes on. But this really should not prevent us from working together or taking an integrated approach, because as you recognize, the climate change amplifies existing risks and introduces other ones, and a risk reduction approach is necessary. The close links must be leveraged and the co-benefits. We don't have resources. We are already limited. The same people dealing with the issues of planning for risk disasters are the same people that have to deal with it for climate change. So we really need to leverage. We need to avoid duplicating our resources. We are small island developing states. The per capita for each individual to support the overall governance of the country is much more than in a larger developed country. So we have to be smart about how we use our resources. We have to increase our effectiveness and promote the sustainability. We have to, I think that risk reduction can certainly assist with connecting policy with practice, because we sometimes tend to think of climate change as being so far away, but it really isn't. And there are some no regrets action that we must take to reduce our risk. We are being affected all now. When you go to a community and they've had flooding, or they can't access water, or as a country, you have food security issues, do you separate it out and say, well, this is climate change, or this is the risk, disaster risk that's impacting me? It really and truly, it's down to the people. The people are being affected by the crisis. And so we have to take holistic community development as the focus, and understand what those risks are, but a holistic approach is necessary to address the problems. The scope and nature of the problem that we're dealing with, Keith spoke to it, it's just too broad. And I want to say it's just too broad, and therefore you can't just have the Ministry of Environment dealing with it. You can't just have the Disaster Management Office dealing with it. And all of governance and all people approach is necessary, which is now where we talk about these polycenters of governance, these independent entities, stakeholders. How do we pull everybody together in a coordinated manner to govern this problem and to respond to the crisis? So this is what I want to take from this slide. So governance from a disaster risk management perspective, and it's quite similar. As Keith said, there are several definitions, but ultimately, we are looking at the institutions, the mechanisms, the policy and legal frameworks, and other arrangements that you have in place, what to guide your risk reduction approach, your climate governance approach, and to coordinate that process of decision making and that process of accountability and the other factors that Keith would have related. This is governance. And so we want to be able to take an integrated approach to how we govern. Here's a picture from Dominica in the aftermath of Maria in 2017, which was a Category 5 storm. Around 80% of the population, 65,000 people, were directly affected. 65 people died. More than 90% of homes were damaged or destroyed. 90% of crops and livestock were lost. power and water supplies were disrupted for months, and telecommunication systems in some areas took over 1 year to restore. The impact of this near total devastation was estimated at EC 3.54 billion, which amounted to the 226% of GDP. This was a phenomenal disaster, and disasters can happen at different levels. You could be overwhelmed in your community, and that's a disaster for you. You could be having a disaster in your home. If there's a fire in your home, you've been overwhelmed by that. But look at this. This was across the country. It was a national disaster. And sectors affected: housing, you heard them, agriculture, electricity, water, telecoms. The question I want to ask, though, is would it have been possible to reduce the level of devastation seen in Dominica? I don't want to say yes. I want to say yes. Was it necessary? Did 90% of homes need to be damaged or destroyed? You may think, is it possible to build for category 5-star? I want to say yes, because there were still some homes that were still standing. And there's a lot of lesson learning. CEDIMA is actually promoting a safer building training course and so on that looks at how can we build towards Cat 5. Was it necessary to have power and water disrupted to the extent that they were? So there have been development strategies in place by the government and even by the private sector to build the resilience of those sectors. This is where the concept of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation step into the discussion of climate governance. So when we talk about being resilient, again, there are several definitions for resilience, speaking to how we resist, can we absorb it, can we accommodate, can we recover? In fact, can we bounce forward? In fact, we don't just want to bounce forward, we want to transform. And this is what the heads of government have adopted. This of resilience for our nations, where we not only go back to the same standard, build back the house the same way that it was before, so that the roof comes off the next time there's a hurricane, but we want to bounce forward. We want to be in a better place. We want to have a better public sector as a result of having gone through that disaster or crisis. So just throw up on the screen here to show you some of the ideas when we talk about mitigation, we talk about mapping hazards, capacity building, even enforcement of codes, preparedness, where you're talking about having your disaster management plan to respond in time of a crisis. Then there's the actual at the time, how do you respond? Do you have your institutions strengthened at the different levels in doing those assessments and so on, damage assessments? Are you ready for that? And then in recovery, building disaster resilient infrastructure and communities. This is the whole country now. All of this, these are the 4 phases of disaster management, business continuity also included. So as a region in 2001, CEDIMA participating states would have adopted a strategy by which we would achieve comprehensive disaster management. And that strategy has been updated, revised throughout the years up to 2024, 2014. What I have on the screen now is the current strategy, which was developed and established the desired future state of the participating states with the regional goal of safer, more resilient and sustainable CEDIMA participating states through comprehensive disaster management. And the 4 priority areas speak to strengthening institutional arrangements for CDM, which is now speaking to how you govern there, your legislation and so forth, your policies, your institutions, fit for purpose to deliver on the mandates that they have, and also 2, increasing the sustained knowledge management and learning, because if you're going to be making decisions, you need to have the evidence-based and improved and integrated system that will inform an understanding as to what are the risks, so that you can be more responsive to those in your planning. 3, improve integration of CDM at the sector levels, including incentives. And I want to highlight outcome 3, where you will have incentive programs developed and applied for the promotion of risk reduction and climate change adaptation in our infrastructure investments in priority sectors. The Caribbean Development Bank has been working very well with us in this area because, you know, when countries take loans and so on to build a school or to a road or whatever it is, they recently have been really pushing to ensure that when these monies are loaned, that the investment is not going to be at risk because it's placed at an at-risk area, or there's no strategy relating to how there will be risk management and so forth. And finally, strengthen and sustain community resilience. People at the core. Cross-cutting themes are shown below, climate change being one of them, and environmental sustainability. So this is how we are integrating climate change adaptation into our frameworks. Internationally, there's a Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and the goal really speaks to what I explained before about what is risk reduction in terms of preventing risk, managing existing risk, and so forth, through this integrated, and I noted a comment before, integrated inclusive measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure, vulnerability, and so forth. So this is what we're going for as a region. This is what our countries have signed onto. The question now really is, how are we filtering down this at the national level? How does the regional, I can tell you that regionally, the CDM strategy and the Sendai, they have been, we've identified the linkages, and the CDM strategy definitely is supporting the implementation of the Sendai framework. And so therefore, if we implement the CDM strategy, we will reach our global targets on the Sendai. Coming out of 2017, the heads also adopted a Caribbean pathway to resilience. And the 5 pillars are shown there, where social protection is the first pillar, enhancing economic opportunity, the second, safeguarding our infrastructure, the 4th, environmental protection, the 5th, operational readiness and recovery, and then in 9 areas that you see here speak to addressing the enabling environment, effective governance being one of those. So the question again, like, these are guiding frameworks, but how are these filtering, how are we filtering these down? How are we incorporating these whole ideas and guidance? And each one of these pillars, there are recommendations. Have you seen these before? So what I can say though is that there seems to be a new dynamic at play as governments push the climate change agenda, and by extension, the resilience agenda. We're starting to see some kind of convergence happening there. To some degree, disaster management is incorporated, disaster risk reduction, but we need to do more on converging and integrating these agendas and explaining, well, what to do with these at the national level, because this is where we make the impact. And so SEDIMA has elaborated a blueprint for doing this. It predates the resilience pathway. It predates the current strategy that we have. And right now we're looking at it to see what improvements are needed. But there is no doubt still that if we are going to see reductions in resilience, reductions in risk, that we need to ensure that we have the appropriate policy and authorities in place in the countries. A country will need a comprehensive disaster management policy. It will need a comprehensive disaster management legislation. It will need a plan and a program to operate to implement that policy. And then you will need to monitor and evaluate. You need to be able to take stock and move from there. And then of course there's drivers. You need political support. You need champions. You need an appropriate organization structure to deliver, and the appropriate capacities for advancing the skill sets, the ICT platforms, and so forth. So we have this, our countries adopted this concept in 2010, but I can tell you that we have not seen the kind of uptake with addressing each of these different areas in our countries. And we have to ask ourselves, we really have to ask ourselves why. We really do. When we develop the country work programs with our countries, there are 11, and they're national, they're meant to be national, they're meant to be country programs for how you're going to achieve the resilience, how you're going to achieve this comprehensive disaster management, save for lives through sustainable development. How will you achieve this? And when we developed that, and looking at what Sendai required, we came up with 11 criteria and guidelines for that country work program. Yes, we would want it to have our template and ensure that it has all the important areas, but it must address the priorities internationally and regionally. You need, the sector focus needs to be there, and we've identified at least 4 of them. And policy coherence is absolutely important, because this now speaks to sustainable development, coherence of the policies on sustainable development, environmental resilience, gender mainstreaming, information communication, poverty eradication, climate change, notably the sustainable development goals, what is articulated there in the Paris Agreement. So we have these, and now regionally, there's the update that's coming through 5Cs. These are all what we would be looking to give us an idea as to the situation and what the priorities need to be and what needs to be combined into this country work program. So that's included there. And then monitoring and ensuring that we reduce risk, prevent, and so forth. And ultimately, to ensure that this kind of document is approved and signed off at the highest level in your government, in your country. There are different levels, but ultimately, this is what we want. This work has been led by the Disaster Management Office, but they really are a broker because, as I said earlier, no one entity can do this. This is all a government coming to sit around the table to discuss. And like I said, you have these emerging plans and programs that are already taken off in countries. In some, I will highlight in a minute, but I just wanted to highlight this is the modality for how we're going to be operationalizing this. This is where we are on policies and legislation in countries. It's quite low, taking this kind of approach. And it's been an evolution over the years, starting with the International Decade of Natural Disaster Risk Reduction in the 90s. And now we're still in progress over the last 20 years, I would say, trying to get the uptake on doing these more integrated policies and legislations for our countries. Ultimately, we also incorporate this whole idea of justice, and the Prime Minister of Barbados has been very vocal on this topic, ensuring that collectively and individually, we have the ability to prepare for and respond to and recover from the impacts. And so therefore, ensuring that those that are contributing to the crisis are providing resources that can be able to allow smaller countries like us who are bearing the brunt to be able to prepare, respond, and recover from the impacts. Absolutely important, and absolutely important to try to keep them accountable. But that has its challenges. It's absolutely important. These are the actors that are involved. Collaboration, cooperation, these keywords continue to come up. And then I just want to highlight Dominica. Dominica developed the Climate Resilience Act in 2018 and the Climate Resilience and Recovery Plan for the period 2020 to 2030 to operationalize the National Resilience Development Strategy. Now, the catalyst for this shift, well, Maria, a disaster. And I would say for the rest of us, let us not wait for a disaster to be the reason why we take the step in this direction. They've also, they've highlighted in their document that effort was also made to integrate the resilience agenda into sector strategic plans and to align capital projects to the resilience vision during the budget process. In Barbados, also there's Roofs to Reef project. It's a project, according to the Minister of Economic Affairs, it's a national resilience program that cuts across the several sectors, and they also would have, Barbados also would have recently developed a comprehensive disaster management policy seeking to connect with this same Roof to Reef program, which speaks to the matter of resilience. But I would say that this still has to be operationalized in terms of how will we work together to implement this kind of coordinated, integrated approach. What are the roles of the different entities and agencies as part of this process? Do we need a paradigm shift in terms of who's leading, who's brokering this? So I wanted to just step back at Dominica and their act, and their Climate Resilient Act goes broad because it seeks to rebuild Dominica as a climate resilient nation, which is better able to withstand future hurricanes, but not only hurricanes, earthquakes, and other natural disasters with minimal loss of life and minimal damage to infrastructure, property, and livelihood. So, and also speaking to physical development. So we really cannot afford separate agendas, and I'm happy to see that Dominica's realized that. We are small countries with small human and financial resources. So what needs to shift for us? We really need to have some reflection. So as I close out, I want to leave with you these quick pointers. What have our experiences with emergencies over the years been teaching us about the effectiveness of our current governance arrangements and key areas for adjustments? What's working? What needs to change? What's needed to elevate and operationalize an integrated climate and disaster governance approach? Is this a CDM governance approach at the ministerial or at your departmental level? Are we recognizing and building the appropriate synergies and interconnectedness across our policies, strategies, plans, and programs? What paradigm shift is needed? And this last slide really just highlights, I wanted to give you something to go with. I've asked the questions, but here are some possible pathways, speaking to integrated agendas, sectoral integration, polycentric governance, where you have multiple formal independent actors from different sectors that can coordinate, that can cooperate to address the common problem. The information management being absolutely important, improving information through comprehensive and systematic assessment of hazards, risks, vulnerability, impact, learning across the institutions, being able to network more, and very importantly, developing comprehensive disaster risk finance and insurance. And I know that there is an upcoming presentation during the series on this topic. These are absolutely, I think that they're important for that imperative for climate governance. And so I just want to leave you then with these 7 possible pathways for adaptive and integrated resilience in climate governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Man, let me tell you, between you and Keith, we attended a university. Thank you so much. And so we are going to open the floor now for further comments, questions, discussion. And Siobhan is actually joining us, I believe, from Canada. So she is, of course, thanking you, Nicole, for your very informative and interesting presentation. And she says, as an NPO leader, I wholeheartedly agree that resilient community initiatives and paradigm shifts must be a part of disaster prevention, relief, and recovery. And so perhaps either you or Keith, I don't know if you're able to just elaborate a little further around, resilient community initiatives, the extent to which we're undertaking some of these as part of our climate governance response. And what is the Caribbean experience with that?
Okay, I can give a quick response to it. SEDIMA actually is working on something called a framework for community resilience, for resilient communities. So this is based on some research that was done by John Twigg, and we looked at it from our Caribbean perspective to be able to adapt that. And so within that framework, we've been identifying what is necessary for a community at the community level to be resilient. And I can share with you what we have on that. The intent really is to use this now to implement our work in communities, whether that relates to on the early warning side of things, on the governance aspects within communities, absolutely important. What we've also recognized is that we don't want to be cherry picking which community to work on, and we don't want politics to sway which community gets the support and assistance because the minister or whoever it is says this one. We want it to be driven by those that are truly vulnerable, those that are truly at risk or at the most risk. And so what we have done, and we're rolling out training now, what we have done is to develop what we call a Caribbean community risk information tool, so that you'll be able to profile the community and be able to say, well, we think Guyana, Trinidad, these are the ones that are the most, let's target our work in these particular areas. Let's now apply that resilience framework. So this work that we're doing is not done by SEDIMA alone, because we have to recognize that different partners have different capacities and spheres of where they have that competence. For example, the International Federation for the Red Cross, working with them, working with other civil society organizations as well, to be able to ensure that they're on board, that they are too willing to apply this kind of approach across our region. So in a nutshell, those are some of the areas that we're working in, and happy to share further information as well.
All right.
If I may comment quickly, yes, thanks, Lloyd. Our investments relate to communities directly and indirectly, and I'll give you some examples of those. We're investing across the entire region and in a whole range of sectors. For example, water remains a key focus for us. For example, in Barbados, there are 2 projects we're running at almost $100 million in value. With the first, which is about a year from closure now, has been operating for the last 4 years. It's valued at $45.2 million, with $27.6 million we got from the Green Climate Fund, and $70.6 million from the Barbados Water Authority. And the second project, which is just starting, is valued at about $50 million, about $40 million from the Green Climate Fund, and about $10 million from the Barbados Water Authority. Now, these are really investments in the water infrastructure, water resilience in the Caribbean, in Barbados particularly, and also utilizing wastewater, something that we need to consider how we utilize and reuse wastewater. So the second project in Barbados is about reusing, recycling wastewater. One of the things we've done under that project is to provide tanks, water tanks for storage and for capturing rainwater to select households, and that's a program that we hope to expand in other countries as well. We're looking at a whole range of investments to helping communities, as I said, directly and indirectly. We're running what is called readiness support. These are readiness projects provided by the Green Climate Fund. Each country has an allocation of about $1 billion a year. And those investments are supported through national designated authorities or direct access entities, such as the 5 Cs. There are 2 such regional entities in the region, 5 Cs and the Caribbean Development Bank. And we have access of up to $50 million per project to invest in the country. So we're actively submitting projects and programs to the GCF for financing our investments in the region. We're also investing in, we're trying to encourage other entities in the countries. In St. Lucia, for example, we're working with the St. Lucia Development Bank. In St. Kitts, we're working with a credit union to become accredited to the Green Climate Fund, and so they could access monies directly for the benefit of the people in the region as well. We're investing in early warning systems. Data is important to everything we do today. We don't have enough data, so we're investing in data capture instrumentation in the form of automatic weather stations, coral reef early warning system stations, hydrology stations across the 16 CARIFORUM states. There's the 14 CARICOM plus the DR and Cuba. And that will help provide the type of information to downscale the global models. So the global models are not necessarily beneficial to us because they don't reflect our size, for one. We're working together with the University of the West Indies, the INSMET from Cuba, the Institute of Meteorology in Cuba, and of course 5 Cs to downscale those global models so we can have information relevant to decision making for communities to take into consideration the impact of sea level rise, the flooding threats to communities, and that sort of thing. So, but we're also investing directly in water resources management in select communities all over the Caribbean. in all 16 CARIFORUM countries, which is 14 CARICOM plus the DR and Cuba. These are specific. We're investing in schools, in public infrastructure, education facilities, to improve their water resilience architecture and infrastructure, to help build the resilience of those, given the fact that droughts and the fact that the region is becoming drier. And this has been a recurring theme in the reports produced by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The region is becoming drier. We may have torrential downpours from time to time, which leads to catastrophic flooding, but it is getting drier, and we need to take that into consideration. So we're looking at all those triggers of threats, and to address those concerns by investing in adaptation initiatives, investing in resilience building efforts, to help communities overall, all sectors. So because again, as I said earlier, climate change will impact every single individual. We have to see what those major threats are and invest accordingly. And this is only just a short list of the things we're doing. Agriculture is the main focus for us as well. Food security, health. And this is where the need to ensure that we're working in partnership with SEDIMA and CARFA and all the other CIMHs is key, CRFM, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, and others to help build that resilience profile across the region.
Keith, there's a follow-up question. You just mentioned a number of regional partners that you collaborate with, but these programs that you identified, do you collaborate with civil society groups and public sector entities specifically in the creation of those programs?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we do. In fact, we've signed an MOU with CANARI because we're working. We don't have the competence, let's say, to work with civil society in 5Cs. Probably will not do. And I think our modus operandi is to ensure that we work with the entities with the competence in this specific area. So, for example, working with CANARI, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, because they have a strong skill set in working with civil society. That is the focus. And we've just entered into a memorandum of agreement with CANARI to utilize their skill sets and their resources to advance our engagement with civil society. So it's for example, SEDIMA will support SEDIMA in everything we can, because SEDIMA's focus on disaster risk management and everything that aligns to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. There are specific skill sets in CDMA that we will not have, and we don't aim to have. So we build that collaboration with the private sector as well. For example, in the readiness projects that we're supporting with Green Climate Fund financing, we are working with both public and private sector entities. So we're trying to get, like I said, the private sector engage in more integrally in climate change resilience building, in mitigation, for example. Mitigation is probably more of a domain for the private sector, because we're talking about investments in energy efficient appliances, in policies and programs to create an enabling environment for us to adopt renewable energy technologies within the region, but that is more a domain for the private sector. So we need the private sector on board in a very meaningful way to contribute to the economic growth and the stability and resilience building efforts within the region as well. So we are working with the private sector, the public sector, definitely. The public sector's role is primarily adaptation focused and helping to create the enabling environment. But it is a complete embracing of the roles and responsibilities of everyone's society that has a responsibility or the resources to advance the global, our regional good, which is resilience building. And there is a call these days to ensure the private sector is firmly on board. How we do this, I think we live in an area where the private sector is relatively risk averse, doesn't necessarily have all the resources to invest in areas which are not clearly, wouldn't clearly provide profits or benefits, but there is a need to ensure the private sector is on board, because ultimately I think a resilience building is going to be down to the attention given to resilience building by the private sector and what could be done on from their perspective.
Thank you. there's a question in relation to any particular projects you know of relates to resilient agriculture and food security that you guys might be working on. Who might be some of the partners you're working with on those projects if they are in existence?
We would obviously want to work with CARDI, the Caribbean Agriculture Research and Development Institute. CARDI has a mandate for advancing food security within the region and also fisheries. So I can't forget, food and fisheries, the marine sector. We have a very close working relationship with the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, which is also based in Belize. And we're actually supporting one project, or two actually, we submitted the Green Climate Fund on behalf of the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, the CRFM. And that will help build the resilience of the fisheries sector to the impacts of climate change. So we have those partnership arrangements and are working with the institutions with those mandates. We haven't, and we've been approached by both AICA and CARDI to advance some of the work. We had submitted one on behalf of CARDI to the Green Climate Fund. And I don't know exactly where that is at, but we are working with CARDI to help advance their own work as relates to building resilience to agriculture, to the impacts of climate change. I know in the report I saw from CARDI some years ago, they were doing things that I'd never heard of. They were truly pioneering and very encouraging. I don't know where that's at because I think CARDI has since changed leadership at the helm. And I'm not sure exactly where that's at, but we do need to re-engage with CARDI in a much broader way to help advance the food security aspirations for this region. I know the president of Guyana, Van Ali, probably has a CARICOM lead head for responsibility for agriculture and is pushing food security in a very big way. But we don't have as strong as engagement with food security. And I think we need to do that. And given the fact that the environment is changing a lot quicker, that we can adapt to the changes we're seeing.
Okay, thank you so much. I have a question, and either of you can respond, or both of you could respond. So obviously, based on both your presentations, whole of government, well, it's not just government, but most of the people here are from public sector across the region. And so speak to us about international best practices or systems that you have seen for whole of government collaboration around this business of climate governance. Because I'm not sure any of our governments are quite there yet in terms of having that very integrated collaborative approach to ensure that all the various arms of government are working in sync, singing from the same hymn book, have the same, sharing the same information, et cetera, that we know that, we are not here, for example, building up high-rise buildings only to block, only to affect another agency negatively in their work. Just to give an example that came to my attention recently. Are there any governments in the world that you think are better at this? What should be some of the things we should be aiming to do to get that whole of government collaboration mechanism in place?
Nicole, do you want to start and I'll follow?
Okay, sure. So in doing the research that I did, actually my PhD was focused on integrating disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And there were quite a number of examples from Australia. For example, one of the concepts there that is in practice is this it's called joined up governance. So with the idea of joined up governance, there is the ideas also behind how you identify when it comes to budgeting for a particular entity or organization. There is a mechanism whereby they have to identify those areas, and they are also tracked those areas that address both risk reduction and also from the climate change side as well. Because oftentimes what has been happening from our side is that we have not been very good at tracking where we're spending money. In some cases, we're doing money on drainage, or we're doing roads or whatever it is, but we don't incorporate an intervention there that would, allow it to be resilient to some kind of climate threat or whatever it is. So what you're finding in cases of Australia, for example, is the joined up governance approach as it relates to budgeting, as it relates to interministerial coordination for the decision making in the area. And so we have tried to model we have a model legislation policy for CDM, some of those ideas within those model documents. And I was also lately reading, as I was preparing for this presentation, about work that is also being done in Europe. Again, they're pushing more for what's called this polycentric governance, where you have independent entities that are responsible and they still have to integrate their agendas, but they are accountable for delivering within an integrated fashion. So, I think that we do have some cases, and there's a space to elaborate or to put together some cases for our region to learn from, that we can refer to and apply. But it's not something that is not happening. It is happening in different parts of the world, and there's definitely a space for us to try to see how we can adapt what we're doing, given the resources we may have. So that's some insight from my side.
Okay, thank you so much. And Faye from Barbados just shared in the chat, this financial year, Barbados, as a part of its budgeting process, they have developed codes to track climate mitigation and climate adaptation expenditure. That's really very good to hear. Thank you so much, Faye, for sharing.
Yes.
And I think,
go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, sorry. This is, I think, where we're going with the region as a whole. We need to be able to track what is climate finance and separate it from what is development finance, because I think one of the arguments at the UNFCCC was that countries are using development finance to mask their contribution to climate finance, and they seem to be separate. The world does not want countries like ours, regions like ours, don't want development finance to be confused with climate finance. They are separate. Development finance will continue and should continue. Climate finance is over and beyond what is considered development finance from the various partners all over the world. And there has to be that separation. So we need to be able to track climate finance separately to see if the world is living up to the commitments that they've made through the Paris Agreement and others. But in terms of the governance mechanisms, there's no one size fits all, for one. And different countries, well, let me reverse a bit. And in one of the slides, I showed the government's commitment, the regional commitment to advancing the work on climate change and building resilience through the vision which is issued by CARICAD heads, through the Lilienthal Declaration, the regional framework and implementation plan. I mean, that is unprecedented, but that represented the commitment on the part of heads in the region to put climate change to the forefront of our decision-making process within the region. The fact that heads have also embraced climate change as a permanent fixture on the agenda of heads, I think is a really, really positive change. Or we're seeing countries like Belize, for example, with a Ministry of Climate Change. It's called a Ministry with Responsibility for Climate Change. Now, there are various formulas that we could probably use to create that sort of governance structure within the countries. I see a three-tiered approach that most countries have in any event, which at the first tier encompasses all the various decision makers, the key players, public sector, private sector, NGOs. And the thing is, we have not done a very good job embracing the private sector, and civil society in decision making, but that is changing. So the first tier, we have all those at decision making. At the middle tier, we have the agency with responsibility for climate change, which could be a climate change department, and the line item in the third tier. So we have that sort of structure, a three-tier arrangement in some of the countries already existing as a means of getting everyone together to ensure that we have a multi-sectoral and multi-agency approach to addressing the impacts of climate change. But that has to be fully operationalized. It has to be given some legitimacy. And this is where we need to have the policy statements, the reform of the policy, institutional frameworks, and of course, legislation to support those changes. So there are things happening. It's not happening as quickly. Government's role is to create that enabling environment to support the changes and the transformation that is necessary. So there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done. But there are some best practices within the region. We don't, unfortunately, have a harmonized approach. Not just yet. And maybe we don't need a harmonized approach. But I think we need to be able to learn from each other's experiences in the region because we do have best practices within the region. But the thing is, and maybe this is where the Regional Coordinating Committee on Climate Change should come in to sort of help share, to provide the platform for enabling the sharing of information and to operationalizing the best practices across the region. But there's quite a bit of work to be done. And there's a role for the CARICAD Lead Head for climate change to help drive that transformation as well.
Thank you so much. Well, we are winding down to the end of this webinar, but I'm going to invite Dr. Nicole Greenidge and then Keith Nichols just to share some parting thoughts. If you were to say, if nothing else, take this away from this webinar, what would that be? And Nicole, while you share, you have just shared a document in the chat with us, so you could probably just elaborate what that is and just share your parting thoughts, and then Keith.
Thank you. So the document that I posted speaks to innovation for our institutions as it relates to urban governance, the case of climate change adaptation. And it really just gives some reflections based on the literature that's out there as to what is being seen across, what's being seen globally, different interventions that cities across the globe are applying to deal with climate risk and to deal with its governance. So it's just an opportunity to learn from those ideas that are out there and to see how they may be applicable to our own Caribbean context. So really just following on from the discussion and the question from before. So what I wanted I gave some initial messages at the beginning of my presentation. And the one, if I were to just state one out of the list of the 6 that I gave, is that I would really like for us to come away from the discussion thinking about the interconnectedness within the policies in our country. You are familiar with them, you know them. Some we may have triggered you to be thinking about, well, do we have a policy on this or that? Does my country have a DM policy? What does that say? I would really like to encourage us to actively understand what those policies are, and to be able to identify from a department perspective what your role will be. And when there are the opportunities, when they open up for you to be invited to come and to participate and to, inform those national discussions, I want you to show up and I want you to contribute. Because oftentimes, for example, what we get when we are, for example, doing the comprehensive disaster management policy with the countries, and we ask, we invite different stakeholders to come, some of them simply don't show up. I think it's ultimately because they don't understand or see that, yeah, you do have a role. So that's the takeaway. You do have a role to play.
Indeed, indeed. We all have a key leadership and advocacy role to play. Thank you. Keith.
Thanks, Loy. Transformation is key. I think we need to understand what it is we're dealing with first and foremost, before we can maybe help others who are not at the forefront of the discussions, are not party to the information that we're sharing. And I don't think we're doing a very good job in sharing information with others who need to understand what it is we're dealing with. And we need to be effective, we need to move away from the silo approach in managing our resources, or the use of our resources. We don't manage resources, manage the use of resources. We're managing people. And so we need to be able to embrace one, that we're living in an era where change is continuous, it's rapid, and it's moving at a rate which is beyond our ability to address in a timely manner. We have to remind people that climate change is not an environmental issue. It is an economic development issue with spin-off consequences for our social fabric and for our physical environment as well, and for people's lives and humanity, livelihoods, and so on. It is an economic development issue. I think the first thing is to move away from creating those labels on those issues. It is a cross-cutting issue. I think you heard Nicole say so as well, that it is a responsibility for every single individual to address. It's not because 5Cs is 5Cs, we got climate change in our name. That is our sole responsibility. It is yours, Loy, and everyone else who is on this webinar, and everyone who isn't on this webinar, to embrace and to be part of that transformation process. And you heard the passion in what Nicole said. It is real because we live the experience and we want to see the transformation. You heard the same sort of emotion in my presentation as well. It is real. It's what we experience on a regular basis, but everyone else has to be part of that transformation. It can't be just 5Cs and SEDIMA and others alone. It has to be collective. But the first thing is to understand what it is we're dealing with, and so everyone can play a collective role. There is a role for governments, like I said, in helping create an enabling environment. We have to work with all parties to ensure that we at least understand where we are and what our responsibilities are. So in a nutshell, the collective responsibility, I think, is what will get us to where we need to go. I recognize that each of us has a role to play. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Keith and Nicole. I mean, just an excellent presentation. I'm sure you're seeing the comments in the chat. Some people, everybody thinks it's just insightful, educational, a good start to our climate webinar series. So thank you so very much on behalf of CARICAD and all the other persons who registered for this webinar. And so we just want to share, before we wrap up, just a few announcements from us. So this is a webinar series, so today is not the only webinar. And so next week, we will have the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, and they will be sharing on the Blue Green Economy Island Scorecard. And the following Tuesday, climate governance and disaster risk financing. We did touch on a few elements of that. So CRIF SPC will be doing a deep dive there. And on May 30, us here at CARICAD, our topic will be on redesigning government for effective climate governance, looking at the case of the public service of the Commonwealth of Dominica. Other things that are coming up, you wanted to save the date, and definitely not unrelated. We're having our virtual symposium on July 11, 2023, and this is free. So you want to save the date and look out for further registration details. This is going to be under the theme, Innovation, Digital Government, and Changing Mindsets for Public Sector Transformation, right? And we currently have our call out for our mid-level leadership development program. Is going to be delivered between September and December of this year. The call is actually out, and you can check our website or social media pages. You want further information on that, email us at info@caricad.net. And just to say that, you know, some of the very topics we're talking about here today is an integral part of the design of our leadership development program. And we look at what's a leader's role and how they can understand and develop that role in terms of our capacity to address issues such as climate governance, all right? So you want to look out for that from us. And we really encourage feedback. You've been giving it some feedback so far, and we wonder whether you'll be so kind as to just fill out a very short survey poll. Roger has posted that in the chat. You see a link there. And so invite you just to click on it. It's really not long. Won't take you more than a minute or two just to fill that out for us and to let us know how this first webinar in our climate governance webinar series went for you. Any other needs that you have, you can also indicate there. And so with all of that said, I just want to thank you kindly for showing up, and we look forward to seeing you next week at webinar number 2. Please, there are many more registration spaces left. So the invitation that you use to register, please forward it to other parties in your organization, other people who you know need to be here and need to build their capacity and their knowledge in this area. Please share, share, share. It is free registration, so you should not miss out. And we hope to send you the slides from today and the recording as well. And the recording will also be placed on our YouTube channel. You can check our Caribbean Center for Development Administration YouTube channel, and you'll see the recording for this and other previous past webinars that we have done. So with that, I bid you a good day. Enjoy the rest of the day and the work week. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.